Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Swedish author Fredrik Backman once wrote, "Everyone has 1,000 wishes before a tragedy, but just one afterward." This seems poignant in the wake of the unfolding tragedy of Afghanistan. What would have been done, what should have been done, and perhaps most importantly, what wasn't done. America faces a long night of the soul like few in recent history. But will she emerge from the ashes of Kabul stronger and more resilient? Or does this episode harken the end of the United States' power on the world stage? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we have quite the lineup for you today. We're joined by Jeff Charles to discuss the precipitous plummeting of President Biden's approval ratings and why the media seem to have turned their back on Lunch Bucket Joe. Also, we're going to delve deep into the China connection with Dave Patterson. How did the Great Dragon manage to maneuver itself into such a position of power with the Taliban, all while the Biden administration was left floundering in the dust? Scott Cosenza is joining in for Talking Liberty to examine the latest issues that impact your rights and freedoms. And we'll be sitting down with conservative powerhouse and syndicated columnist Cal Thomas to get to the heart of the matter on Afghanistan and what it means for America going forward. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com. That's where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and you get a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Now, it's a big show this week on the Radio America Network. We're going to be looking for answers rather than asking the same old tired questions. We have a stunning range of guests to help provide us those answers, so it's time for some truth. When one nation has a crisis, others may see opportunity. And this is exactly what's happened with the Great Dragon, China. As the United States is chased out of Afghanistan, China is setting up its pipe and slippers, as you might say, for the long haul. What does this mean for the three nations involved? Well, to help us answer this and figure out the odds, we're joined by retired Air Force pilot and former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Mr. Dave Patterson. Welcome on board, Dave.
Mark, it's great to be with you.
Thanks ever so much. Now, let's start with the most simple question. How did China manage to maneuver itself into this enviable position, and what gains is Beijing hoping to make?
Well, I think that Beijing is actually attempting to do perhaps three things. First, the Belt and Road Initiative for global circling and being pretty much the biggest power militarily and economically in the world would benefit from exploiting Afghan resources, and I think that's part of it. Secondly, I think despite what it looks like, the Taliban are terrorists. One commentator said savages in sandals, but nonetheless terrorists, mercurial, and they can turn on the Chinese over the slightest perceived insult. And I think that lastly, the Taliban is a failed state, regardless of what it may look like right now, and it's a clean sheet of paper for the Chinese. But that assumes, of course, that the PRC can, do something about it.
So how did they get into this position, though, the Chinese? Because as you point out, it's a failed state, but a failed state is one that's ripe with opportunity for resource exploitation, for, as you say, developing its Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, there's a border issue there as well. So how did they maneuver this when, we have talked about this before, but how did they maneuver this when America failed to?
Well, I think that the Chinese are very patient, and they have simply taken advantage over a period of time, building a relationship with the Taliban. And now that they see that the United States is clearly moving out and has done a pretty feckless, pitiful, incompetent performance in Afghanistan, they see that as an opportunity. But as I said, it comes with a certain amount of caution on their part.
Yeah, when Joe Biden first began campaigning to become president, a lot of critics pointed out that he would be soft on China, none more so than President Donald Trump, who said, I believe he coined the nickname Beijing Biden. And so when compared to Trump, how does the Chinese government see the U.S.-Sino relations in the wake of the Afghan disaster?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's fairly clear that Beijing does not hold the Biden administration in much regard. I mean, we saw that in their first meeting in Anchorage. And I think that China believes they have the geopolitical high ground, especially, during this, as I said, pitiful performance of the United States in Afghanistan.
So what does this mean for Taiwan?
Well, as much as I hate to promote global news, the Communist China Party propaganda arm, there's some value in what they say, and that it does give you some clues to what they're thinking. And when it disparages Biden's leadership and it openly threatens Taiwan, there's a message there. And that said, no one should be confused. I think that for as much disregard as the CCP may have for Biden and his national security team leadership, there's no lack of respect, on the other hand, for the United States Navy and its presence in the South China Sea.
Yeah, I'd agree there. Now, for China, getting in on the ground level with with the Taliban leadership, it's a major win. This is a nation, as we talked about, it's rich in natural resources. It has little clue how to run what we'd call a modern state. And at the moment, its wealth is tied up or frozen by the United States and the IMF. Now, surely all these factors are giving Xi Jinping a lot more leverage than he would normally have. How does the US react to this?
Well, I think the United States is not in a very good position to react one way or the other. I think that the attention is so focused on the precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan and the mess that's caused, that it's not clear to me that the United States National Security Team has any focus on that at all. And they're going to, when the dust is settled, come back and find that the Chinese are well ensconced in Afghanistan for good or bad, but nonetheless, they'll be there. And their presence there is a problem.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there would be some issues, potential issues on the ground there. Internally, China shares a border with Afghanistan. It's around 50 or 60 miles worth. I think 57. But as has been widely reported, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, it has quite the issue with its own Muslim population. Do you think that down the line this could become a flashpoint?
Absolutely. I think that the mullahs in Afghanistan and the religious leaders in the Taliban are going to, at some point, take issue with the fact that the Uyghurs are being persecuted. And it's unlikely that Beijing will change its position regarding the suppression of the Uyghurs, in as much as they see them as terrorists. And that becomes a problem.
Dave, final question, if I may. How does Joe Biden effectively tackle this upset in let's call it the balance of power? If China allies itself with Afghan, then it seems that any interference with Afghanistan will be seen as interference with Chinese overseas affairs. Well,
I believe that China probably doesn't see the Taliban as an ally, but more of a geopolitical tool. But the way in which the Biden administration would be more successful is simply to focus on the South China Sea, the Indo-Pacific, and build up our forces there in a way that show the Chinese that any adventurism on their part will be dealt with and severely. And it probably isn't worth it for them to do that in the meantime.
Dave, I think many people would question whether Joe Biden would have the appetite for that kind of thing. But I do thank you so much, so very sincerely for being here. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Mark. Always good to be with you.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be speaking with one-man conservative dynamo Cal Thomas about what happens to America when the dust finally settles on the Afghan debacle, and whether America can really make a comeback. But coming up after this short break, we'll be speaking with Jeff Charles on the ever-decreasing popularity of President Joe Biden. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. It seems that President Biden is suffering the figurative death by 1,000 cuts as his popularity begins to wane, and with the Fourth Estate turning on him since the fall of Kabul, Joe just can't catch a break. So what are the details of this epic fall from grace, and what ramifications does it portend for his political agenda? We're joined by author and podcaster Jeff Charles to delve into the topic and see if we can't find some nuggets of truth in the debris field of Joe Biden's presidency. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So, Jeff, let's start simple. What are the latest numbers showing?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a few different polls that have come out recently, but they all indicate that Biden's approval has plummeted. The most recent that I've seen from NBC News has him at about 49% approval. And he's, for the first time in his presidency, he's underwater. And a lot of it has to do with Afghanistan.
Okay, yes. So there was obviously the NBC one, I think, had him the 48% disapproval. But there was also a Hill poll that had him on 49. I think that's the one you're referring to. But there's quite a few that have shown him actually in sub-popularity figures, which, considering his record to date so far over the first 7-8 months, is quite surprising. Now, does Biden have a way to claw back his popularity? And probably more importantly, how much cooperation with the media would this involve?
Well, what's amazing about this is that all of this is happening and he hasn't even been in office for a year yet. So that's kind of a two-edged sword. One, it shows how incompetent his administration is, but it also shows that he still has a lot of time to regain that popularity. And with the help of the activist media, that can happen. However, I'm not confident that it will. Again, the Biden administration has shown a remarkable level of ineptitude when it comes to handling issues like the Afghanistan withdrawal, the migrant crisis, inflation. I mean, they don't have enough victories to outweigh the bad yet. I mean, Biden has accomplished some things, but in general, his presiding over these issues has been abysmal. If this trend continues, and assuming that he actually makes it through his first term without stepping down, it's not going to look good for the Democrats in 2024, specifically for Vice President Kamala Harris, who I do think is going to be the person that they put up, whether she's president by that time or not.
We will certainly be coming to the 2022 and 2024s later on in this segment, Jeff. But why has the media just abandoned Joe Biden over Afghanistan? It seems they were willing to back him through the ever-growing migrant crisis, the economy in tatters, because, of course, as I read recently, people going back to jobs that they had before the government-sanctioned lockdowns is not creating new jobs. But the media seem so willing to abandon him over Afghanistan. Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm not confident that they've abandoned him yet, Mark. I mean, I think when it comes to Afghanistan, because I've been thinking about this a lot, because you're right, they have defended him throughout the migrant crisis and inflation. Although with the migrant crisis, he did get some criticism for not being transparent. But in general, they haven't been reporting on that issue as harshly as they would if it were Trump in office. When it comes to Afghanistan, though, this is kind of a different animal. This situation has been handled so badly that there's no way they can spin it. There is no way that they can spin it. And they also have to maintain their own reputation for being supposedly anti-war, which they were all through the Bush years, Obama years, and so on and so forth. So I think that's why they're changing their tack a little bit, but I don't expect for this to last. Now, right now, they're doing their job. They're reporting critically on the Biden administration. And if this happened under Trump, they would be even more critical. But this isn't going to last, so we shouldn't get used to it. Once this blows over, they're going to go back to being Biden's Ministry of Propaganda.
Okay, that seems the most fitting term, the Ministry of Propaganda from the Fourth Estate. Now, there was always that, as they say, the caveat emptor with Joe Biden, the buyer beware, especially on foreign policy. They knew that the Democrats and the media, that they knew that they were getting a man who was described as, I believe it was being wrong on almost every single foreign policy issue for the last 40 years. Did they think this would not come up, or were they hoping that there wouldn't be a situation that would put this to the test?
Oh, they definitely knew it was going to come up. If you recall, during the presidential debates, on the third debate that he had with Trump, that was supposed to be about foreign policy. If you remember, the third debate is always about foreign policy. They changed it. And I contend then what I contend now. The only reason they changed it is because they knew that Trump's foreign policy was much better than anything that happened under the Obama administration. If you remember, Obama's foreign policy was abhorrent. Biden is not good on foreign policy, so they had to change that debate because they knew that would make Trump look good. Fast forward to now, we're now reaping the consequences. So they knew this was going to happen, but they had to get Trump out. So they didn't care how this affected foreign policy. They don't care about Biden's ineptitude. Orange man bad, we got to get him out. And now they're dealing with the consequences of that. And I think that they knew that this sort of thing would probably happen.
Okay, Jeff, now, how do you think this will impact this drop in his numbers and, as you say, the temporary waning of support within the Fourth Estate? How do you think this will impact the 2022 midterms? Or will it all be over by then, one way or the other?
It's just going to be another nail in the coffin. I mean, the Democrats have a lot to be afraid of in 2022. And from what I'm reading, they know it. So this will be yet another reason why people might want to give Republicans control of Congress again. The thing is that with all of these things, the migrant crisis, inflation, and all of these other issues, there's still the fact that he hasn't been able to pass a whole lot of meaningful legislation. I mean, he might be able to get this infrastructure thing will probably go through. Other than that, with the way Congress is made up, he's not going to be able to get much done. And if the Republicans are smart, they're going to continue hammering this point home even beyond the midterm elections, especially the flawed withdrawal from Afghanistan. Because for a lot of us, this is the end of an era. I mean, I was 20 years old when 9/11 happened. And a lot of other people were my age too. And so ending this war is almost like closing that chapter. The way he closed the chapter, it was ugly. And people aren't going to forget that anytime soon, especially if the Republicans are able to continue to hammer this on this point.
Jeff Charles, thank you ever so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Don't touch that dial. Coming up later on Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio America Network, we'll be speaking one of America's most widely syndicated columnists, Cal Thomas, on the fine mess that Joe Biden finds himself in, and why he's dancing to the Taliban tune. But before that, after this short break, we'll be talking liberty with Mr. Scott Cosenza, Esquire, to examine the cases that are impacting your rights and your freedoms today, and whether in this week's battle, liberty has been won or lost. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Liberty may be won and lost in the houses of Congress, but it's in the courts that we either witness the final nails in the coffin or the Lazarus-like resurrection with bright line rulings. And no one follows the rise and fall closer than Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the excellent and engaging Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott Cosenza. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you.
So, Scott, we have a wealth of stories to cover today. And the one I want to get to is what's happening with InfoWars and the Department of Justice's media policy. What's going on there?
Well, it seems like the Department of Justice has been caught playing with different rules for people whose ideas they favor rather than people's whose ideas they disfavor, which is,
specifically, of course, Alex Jones and Owen Schroyer over at InfoWars.
Well, the person we're talking about now is Owen Schroyer, who is a host on, I think, one of Alex Jones's properties. I'm not
on several.
I can't certify that, but I can certify that the federal judge, U.S. magistrate judge Zia Faruqi, challenged Justice Department lawyers at a hearing as to whether or not they obeyed their own policy on prosecuting or investigating members of the media, and they declined to answer on the record and basically said that it's not a question for the judge to get into. This is something we're now seeing, Mark, across the board with the federal courts, which is that federal judges are reacting to the Biden administration in similar ways to the way they reacted to the Trump administration, which we know that many on the left championed when it was happening to the Trump administration, and they're not seeing it the same way when it's happening to the Biden administration.
It's almost as if they weren't aware that if somebody does something to one person and gets away with it, they could do it to you too.
It's like they feel like there's no such thing as like they're not hypocrites. It's hilarious because that's, of course, what they are, and it's one of the worst sins, I think, is to be a hypocrite, and that's what the Department of Justice seems to have done here, which is to prosecute Mr. Schroyer for the content of his reporting and his ideas rather than his actions. This is about what he did on January 6th and whether or not he is criminally liable for his behavior at the Capitol on January 6th.
So where does this go from here for Mr. Schroyer?
Well, we have to see how it shakes out in the federal courts, but the hypocrisy is laid bare, and we'll have to enjoy them backpedaling and trying to come up with some kind of rationale for their disparate treatment.
So moving on, Scott, I know there's a case that you're particularly interested in, which is the Miami Beach has suspended enforcement of law used against filming the police. Now, we have talked about this briefly before. Could you give us a brief encapsulation of what it is and what the new development is here?
Well, the city of Miami Beach passed a law that allowed police to arrest people. I think it's within 20 feet or so,
30 feet, I believe,
where they're conducting police operations. And the police have used that law to arrest people peaceably standing by and videotaping them and really abusing those people as they arrest them. There are a number of instances where they stomped on these people, and also where they used them to arrest people who were recording the police just viciously beat an arrestee in like a swarm. I mean, the takeaway from this is that Miami Beach police, Mark, are so out of control that the leadership of the Miami Beach Police Department has told their officers they are not to be trusted with this law. They can't be trusted to enforce it neutrally and against people who otherwise are behaving peaceably. It's a amazing story, I think, of what's become of a police department run amok.
It strikes me that in the day when we all appear to be under some kind of surveillance, that there would even be a law or regulation passed that would stop people filming in public, which is a First Amendment, an aspect of the First Amendment rights. It shocks me that such a thing would even happen.
You can't do it. You absolutely can't do it. Now, they've tried to get around that, what would be a prohibition on that, Mark. A clearly established First Amendment law says that you have the legal ability to film the police if you have the legal ability to be in the place where you are filming. In other words, you can't go behind closed doors in a chief of police's office and film the police. But if you're standing on a street corner and you're allowed to, you can stand there and film the police. And what they've done is they've tried to add that this is somehow an interference with the police because they have to be worried about where you're standing or something like that. It seems like this law will not pass First Amendment ruling, and those things are certainly coming to court. And what I think's happened here, Mark, is the city fathers and the police chief have seen that just the limited time that the police have been able to enforce this law. Number one, they've taken it as a sort of get out of administrative trouble free charge for arresting people who are annoying them or who they wish weren't recording them. That seems to be what we have. You couple that with the legion of Miami Beach police officers that are totally willing to literally beat handcuffed suspects bloody just to get out their own frustrations, apparently. And the city fathers are scared that there's going to be a mountain of civil judgments coming down the pike, and certainly there are. So while I think the law should never have been passed in the first place, at least it's, I suppose, some cold comfort that they're going to respond to the soon to come down judgments against them by reining in the police.
Now, it's been suspended, this law against filming police. It's been suspended.
Well, what they've said, Mark, just to be clear, is they've told their cops, do not enforce this law. So
right.
the once you pass a law, it's not like the chief of police can suspend the law, but he can tell his officers, do not enforce this law because you don't know how to enforce it clearly. That's what we have. The chief of police saying, because you can't do this the right way, don't do it at all at this point.
So will the law be rescinded at some point? I think this is quite an important question. So it's a law that was introduced, it was applied at the direction of the chief of police, presumably, and found to be unapplicable with the standard of police that they have in the Miami Beach area. And so will they now either tweak the law, figure out methods to make police officers apply it in a proper manner, or will they admit that it was probably unconstitutional and just remove it entirely and take the hit for that?
Well, there are all sorts of options available that aren't unconstitutional. We don't know yet which path they will choose, but it's going to be different than it was previously, which was go ahead, Miami Beach police, and swarm and attack any citizen that you basically disfavor while they're recording you in public. Just before we move on, Miami Beach taxpayers are sure going to feel the impact of the way that law was enforced, because we're going to see multiple seven-figure judgments, I predict, based on the beatings and the arrests that Miami Beach police engaged in and used this law as a cover for.
We'll see if this becomes the political hot potato for 2022. Scott Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Coming up next on Liberty Nation Radio, we're lucky enough to be joined by author, columnist, patriot, and conservative thought leader Cal Thomas to talk Biden, America, and the great game. It's going to be quite the show. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. The situation in Afghanistan is, to say the least, precarious. No one really knows what the next few months will bring, but many suspect economic collapse, humanitarian atrocities. But that's on the Afghan side. What about America? How does the United States move forward? Well, to answer that question, we're joined by prolific author of both articles and books, his latest tome being America's Expiration Date, The Fall of Empire, Superpowers, and the United States. He's also one of the leading lights of the modern conservative movement, Mr. Cal Thomas. Many thanks for being here, Cal. Once again, it's really a treat for both me and the listeners. Much appreciated.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Always a pleasure to be with you.
So I can't get started with the questions until we do a quick take. The day of the tragic deaths of 13 American soldiers in Kabul from the suicide bombings, Joe Biden took to the podium to speak. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, Mark, I thought it was one of the weakest responses I've ever heard and lacking in credibility. He said all the right things. He talked about avenging the deaths of the 13 Marines and the 90 Afghans. Let's not forget them too. But it just lacked credibility. You don't make those kinds of threats while you're surrendering and retreating and withdrawing. That doesn't strike fear into the heart of any of our enemies. And they are more than the Taliban, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda, who have been encouraged and energized by this non-policy by this president. I went back and took another look at Franklin Roosevelt's tremendous speech to the Congress right after Pearl Harbor in 1941. Listen to what he said and contrast it with what Biden said. Here's Roosevelt. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. The Congress rose up as one in approval and applause. The contrast is overwhelming. Biden strikes no fear into the heart of anyone except the American people who fear that he is not up to the job.
I think your sentiments there are echoed by just about everybody who watched the briefing. So, Cal, in one of your recent syndicated columns that I picked up on Fox News about how Afghanistan's horror will spread and whether Team Biden has a grip on reality, it's a very worrisome but thought-provoking piece, and I recommend that everybody heads over there and reads it. But it did leave me with a lingering question. How does the world view America once the dust settles? And by this I mean both her allies and her enemies.
I think it views America now as a Hollywood marriage, right after the promise to never forsake you and to forsake all others. The United States is forsaking all others. The credibility of the United States is based on its ability to keep its promises. Our allies, not only in the UK, but around the world now, are looking at what has happened and rightfully wondering whether our promises are any longer valid. We talk in terms of economics of the full faith and credit of the United States in paying our bills. But what about the full faith and credit of the United States when it comes to our allies, when it comes to paying any price, bearing any burden, as John F. Kennedy said in his 1961 inaugural address? Apparently, we're not willing to pay any price anymore or bear any burden. We're willing to spend ourselves into oblivion, now approaching $30 trillion on domestic programs, but we're not willing, at least credibly, to stand up against enemies, both foreign and domestic. I think it has created an enormous credibility problem. The United States cannot be an island standing alone. We are part of a greater world conflagration. And if the United States cannot be trusted to keep its word, what does that say to the rest of the world and our friends, as well as our enemies?
Yeah, Nigel Farage had a very similar opinion to that when he said it would be very unlikely, in his opinion, that Britain would choose to back any military interventions that the United States gets involved in, because he felt that Britain couldn't trust the military machinery with Joe Biden as its leader. Now, Cal, upon becoming president, Joe Biden, he famously said, and he said this several times since, America's back. And it was quite the boast. And I guess many of his opponents would argue that the real display of Western strength was under President Donald Trump. But with the U.S. let's call it flailing on the world stage, how does America get back again?
Well, I think we have to elect the right leaders. The past election, the most recent election, was more about people who didn't like Donald Trump's personality than it was about people who favored Joe Biden's personality or programs. Trump did it to himself. He committed political suicide by his constant demeaning of other people. Now, you might not like someone on the other side of your party or who have a different persuasion, but America has a certain Puritanism DNA left over from the past, that even while we are criticizing someone else, we do not try or seek to demean their value. Reagan was best at this. He would say, our friends on the other side or our friends in the other party, and then he would go on to criticize a particular policy or position. That's the way to do it. You don't do it by talking about crying Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, or crazy Nancy, the Speaker of the House. People don't like that. And that's why a lot of Republicans who I know voted for Biden as a rebuke against Trump. So I think there's a lot of remorse now, a lot of regret about electing Biden, but we've got over a year until the next congressional election, and 2024 is a long way away. I'm not sure Biden's going to make it that far. I'm really not. I never thought that he had the physical or mental standing to last 4 years in office. And if that doesn't happen, we get Kamala Harris, who is a disaster waiting to happen.
A lot of people would agree with that sentiment, Cal. Now, when Joe Biden met with the G7, he was under pressure to extend the deadline for withdrawal, but he shut down the allies, which harkens back to what you were saying earlier. Why do you think that he found it so easy to dismiss those who have worked hand in hand as partners for so many decades, and yet can't muster an equally forceful attitude to a gang of marauding Taliban and their undercover allies in ISIS-K?
Well, I want to pick up on what you said about our allies, because he promised during the campaign and has promised since he was president that we're going to rebuild our relationships with our allies. And that this is something he alleged that Donald Trump didn't do, that he was just a one-man band. But this August 31st deadline, Mark, was simply arbitrary. It was made up in Biden's own mind. If you look at his record as former Secretary of Defense under Barack Obama, Bob Gates has said, Biden has been wrong on every foreign policy issue for 40 years. All he has known is a political life. He has never done anything other than politics. He has no military experience. He has no real world economic experience. He's drawn a paycheck only from the taxpayers of the United States. He's never really accomplished or done anything. He even admitted that those shovel-ready jobs under Biden, I guess, were not shovel-ready. He laughs about these things. Kamala Harris cackles all the time about things. They are unserious. They are not strong. And the Taliban and ISIS and Al-Qaeda look at this, and they've now taken over a country, and they're stronger than they were on 9/11. They have weapons that the American taxpayers paid for. They have helicopters now. They have the most sophisticated and up-to-date rifles and ammunition that we've left behind. They're coming after us again, and probably the UK as well, since the UK was our allies in this effort, along with other nations. But they're coming after us, and I think the next attack is going to be worse than the first one. And the blood will be on the hands of Joseph R. Biden.
Cal Thomas, thank you ever so much for joining us.
A pleasure, Mark.
I want to leave you with a few thoughts before we finish this week's show. There's an idea that we can change our lives through intent, literally as the clock ticks from 1 second to another. All it takes is the decision and the will to carry out that which you believe is right. When history looks back on this Afghanistan withdrawal and the actions taken, and of course the consequences of those actions, will students and historians say that, well, it was an inescapable conclusion? Or will they marvel at how the administration seemed to set on a singular course, and despite all advice, despite all evidence demonstrating that this was going seriously awry, as the second hand of the clock ticks from one marker to the next, the administration refused to change course? President Biden, as leader of the free world, appears to have locked America and her allies around the world on a singular path. And the sad truth is that we know where this leads. Now is a time of challenge. It's a time of adversity. We must all face it with bravery and fortitude, and most of all, with strength. As Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, valor consists in the power of self-recovery, so that a man cannot have his flank turned, cannot be outgeneraled, but put him where you will, he stands. This can only be by his preferring truth to his past apprehension of truth, and his alert acceptance of it, from whatever quarter, the intrepid conviction that his laws, his relation to society, his Christianity, his world, at any time may be superseded and deceased. I want to thank all of our guests on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio America Network. Dave Patterson, Jeff Charles, Scott Cosenza, and Cal Thomas. I appreciate all of you taking the time to be here. And I want to thank you, the listeners, for your support. This week's episode is dedicated to Pernell Bird, who sadly passed. He was a husband, a father, a musician, a writer of enormous talent, and a man who made the world a better place for all who knew him. He'll be sadly missed. Until next time, thank you for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.